Right, shall we move on? Thank you very much. Right, can I introduce our president a little more fully? Professor Pittock was brought up in Aberdeen, and he went to the University of Glasgow at the age of 16. And after an MA in Glasgow, he went to Balliol College, Oxford, for his DPhil. And at Oxford, at Balliol, he was the Oxford University debating champion with Boris Johnson, and was a member of the British Isles debating team which toured the USA. He ran the Express newspaper's Scottish National Debating Competition in 1982-3, and he's had a long media career with over 1,700 appearances in some 50 countries, so well used to being in front of the camera. Professor Pittock was a lecturer and then reader in the University of Edinburgh. In 1996, he became Professor of Literature at the University of Strathclyde, and in 2003, he became Professor of Scottish and Romantic Literature at the University of Manchester, and in 2007, he returned to Glasgow as the Bradley Professor. Professor Pittock's contribution to Scottish literature, history and culture is simply enormous. He's written on Jacobite literature and the Jacobite armies, on the nature of national culture, the construction of Celtic identities, and the existence and nature of a distinctive Scottish Romanticism. His study of Culloden was selected as one of the 10 best history books of the year by History Today, and it was recommended as reading for all non-Scottish MPs. That was good advice. In 2018, Professor Pittock published the first ever scholarly edition of Robert Burns and James Johnson's Scots Musical Museum. He is working on the global history of Scotland with Yale, and he and I have just been talking about this, and he's acting general editor of the Edinburgh edition of Alan Ramsay. In 2014, he founded the International Association for the Study of Scottish Literatures. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and has received many distinctions. He has also, unlike many academics actually, been most generous in his willingness to advise the Scottish Government and public bodies, and he is the National Knowledge Exchange Champion 2022, and the presentation is at Glasgow Science Centre tomorrow, I think. Now, I can think of no one better to be our president at this time, and Professor Pittock, may I ask you to come and address us, please.
Thank you very much, Sir Iain, and thank you and Lady Torrance for your hospitality tonight. And thanks also to Lee and to Michael, who've done so much to maintain the club at a time when not only is clubability at more of a premium than perhaps it's been until very recent years, but also, of course, we've been forcibly prevented from foregathering in company, which I hope, I certainly do, we all appreciate. So, after an introduction like that, of course, whatever follows is a disappointment. And I can have complete confidence in that, so if anyone wants to make their way now, that would be completely fine. You know where the door is, but I hope you've got drink in your glasses which may stave off the evil moment. So I'm going to talk tonight briefly, unless anyone interrupts, in which case it may go on a bit longer, on Scott and speed. Because we're marking here not not only the 112th anniversary of the Scott Club, but the 200th anniversary of the first royal visit to Scotland since the Union. And it's very much a marker of memory, a time of remembering the great history of this city, of its writers and of its festivals, which certainly go back at least to 1822. And it's possible in doing that to be so much in love with our country's own past that some, such as, for example, the critic George Lucas, claimed that Scott, who very much was in love with that past, very seldom speaks of the present. But actually, that's not quite true. Scott is not just a writer who speaks to the past, but to the present, and, as he perhaps never anticipated, to the future. And that's my subject tonight. Obviously, in the letters of Malachi Malagrave, or the Life of Napoleon, Scott speaks to the present, and indeed the Antiquary, despite its deceptive title, is of course set within Scott's own lifetime in the 1790s. So the idea that Scott is only in love with the past is an understandable error. But those who interpreted Scott, those who responded to Scott, they understood that to be an error from the beginning. So in France, the translations of Auguste Jean-Baptiste de Faucompré re-identified the central historic conflict in Scott's novels in terms which he would never have conceived of. They identified them as the Bourbons against the Republic. And a tradition of pro-Stuart sentimental genre painting in France was built on de Faucompre's translations. In Hungary, somewhat later, the Magyar aristocracy saw Scott as symbolising their struggle for the rights of the crown of St. Stephen in the 1848 revolution, at the same time as their German-speaking revolutionary counterparts were thrilling to Ferdinand Freiligrath's more radical Trotz Alledame translation of Burns's A Man's a Man for All That. Most famously, perhaps, Mark Twain, in Life on the Mississippi, 1883, attacked the medieval business of Scott with his enchantments, the sillinesses and emptinesses, sham chivalries of a brainless and worthless, long-vanished society. Twain identified Scott famously with the Confederacy, and went on to satirise Scott's fictional project by mocking Ivanhoe, Scott's most prominent novel in translation and reception, in A Connecticut Yankee at King Arthur's Court in 1889. Even those American writers more sympathetic to Lost Worlds, like William Faulkner, adapted rather than opposed Twain's influential vision, which is widespread elsewhere. 2 weeks ago, I saw a production of Lucia de Lammermoor in the Wiener Staatsoper, which opposed the Tar House of the Ravenswoods to the Ashtons' Georgian Villa, which on the set looked powerfully like Broughton House in East London Street. But tonight I bring you a different Scott, a Scott of speed, technology and modernity. This Scott should not altogether come as a surprise to us. We are only 600 metres from the second largest railway station in the UK, named Waverley in 1854 on the occasion of the amalgamation of the Northbridge, General and Canal Street stations, 8 years after the adjacent Scott Monument was inaugurated. Less familiar, perhaps, is the 240 Caledonian Railway locomotive Jeanie Deans, exhibited at Shandon for the first time in 1890 and used for the Edinburgh-London service daily from 1891 to 99. Or its successor, the 440 Scott-class locomotives, the clues in the name, built for the North British Railway and transferred to LNER in 1923. The Scott class included Rob Roy, 1909, Red Gauntlet, 1909, Jeanie Deans, all 1909, Bailey Nicol Jarvie and Vicky and Vore a couple of years later, and no fewer than 38 other locomotives named after characters or novels of Walter Scott. The last withdrawn from service was Father Ambrose in 1959. These developments themselves built on a pre-existing tradition of naming 440 major engines pulling express trains after Scott novels, beginning with the GWR Waverley class of 1855, which used the 2.14 metres broad gauge introduced by Isambard King and Brunel, which was supposed to provide more stability and a better ride. And that Waverley class was designed for express travel on GWR broad gauge systems and produced several locomotives based on Scott novels to express the technological innovation and modernity of the Great Western Railway service, although in the end the broad gauge was to be superseded and left service in 1892. Later, Great Western Railway Class 442s and LNER D11s continued the pattern of Scott's names. But it's not only trains. Throughout the 19th century, Scott's novels and poems had also been associated with technological development on water, whether by steam power or the clipper which initially rivaled it. 6 Victorian clippers bore names from Scott, produced from yards from Aberdeen, Glasgow, Greenock, London, Sunderland and the United States, while Rob Roy, launched only a year after the book was published, became the first cross-channel steamer, and a tradition of Clyde steamers named for Scott novels, of which there are too many to enunciate, continues up to the present in the shape of the P.S. Waverley, the 16th to bear the name. We could continue to amass such lists, but what do they tell us? They tell us about a 19th century which is perhaps different from the one we remember. A one which represents the Scottish leadership of the annihilation of space through time, to quote Karl Marx. One Karl Marx quotation can't do any harm, surely. A quadrupling of world trade driven by fleets of steamers for goods, migrants and mail. A quadrupling of world trade. Lines of rail to prize open remote interiors for occupation and trade, pushed in between great port cities, beachheads, and the great agents of steam globalization, heralded by the developments of James Watt, Symington's 1788 steamboat, and Henry Bell's first European steamboat service of 1812, in a tradition that reaches to the Waverley steamer of today. James O'Queen's Royal Mail Steam Packet Company of 1838, Arthur Anderson and Brodie McGee Wilcox's Peninsular and Oriental line, later chaired by Aberdonian Sir Thomas Sutherland's MP for Greenock, where an awful lot of the ships seem to have been built, but we didn't have social media in those days. And the Aberdeen Bow Clippers, the print of Scots on infrastructure was well established, and Scott, hence perhaps the large number of Scott-derived names from Ivanhoe Hotel in Sydney to the Waverley suburb in New York and the 2101 Waverley Street in Palo Alto, which was the family home for a significant amount of time for Steve Jobs, was the frequent moniker, both as places where they settled and the ties that bound them together. And when we think about not only the modes of travel and the speed of travel, but of Scots abroad, we see a world where Burns and Scott were some of the key ties that brought Scottish associations closer together, which melded Scots in diaspora more than anything else. To take just 2 brief examples, at the 1879 Waverley Ball at Shanghai, guests were required to dress as characters from Scott's novels. Shanghai is a bit far from Melrose. While at the 1921 St Andrew's Ball, the North China Daily Herald for 3rd December 1921 breathlessly remarked that clan shields hung on the walls together with Lochaber axes and quotes from Scott, while each of the big windows framed a Stuart tartan piper illuminated by hidden lights in settings of heather and greenery. As with Burns' suppers, such infrastructure was a key bonding agent. Scott and his characters were not a vision of the past, but of how the past turns into the present, without forgetting or losing faith in itself. And the celebration of Scotland, at a time when in important respects the Scottish nation no longer existed on the world stage, understandably chose Scots' progress with memory of what we value, have lost, or must not lose, as a metaphor for itself. Embracing the future while not forgetting the past is a very clear definition of a great deal of Scottish history and culture in the last 3 centuries. And Scott himself was the knowing instigator of this, notwithstanding the crudity of Mark Twain's accusations. Exactly at the halfway point of the 60 years since between the rising of 1745 and the novel which was written about it, which escapes me at present, but I'm sure someone can supply it, lay the building of the Fourth Clyde Canal, which not only had just produced the first steam passenger service when Waverley was written, which was from the beginning designed to close the economic gap between the Scottish and British economies, and played a significant role in doing so. In the 1820s, of course, Scott was himself chair of the Edinburgh Oil Gas Company, and in a typically innovative paradox of old and new, prioritised the fitting of gas lighting in his library at Abbotsford. And I think the room is significant, because it's that paradox, the inner sanctum of the musty and ancient, bathed in the classic technology of Georgian modernity. But if the thought of Sir Walter as a fossil fuel entrepreneur is too much to take for the present generation, before we divest from him, I would want to leave you with an older metaphor for speed. Mechanised rail and water transport made the Scottish medievalism of the Eglinton tournament and Scots landscapes more accessible to a mass tourism market shepherded to the Trossachs and elsewhere by providers like Leicester man Thomas Cook. Cook's arranged Scottish tours were themselves a phenomenon which had been experienced by 1 million travellers by 1864, and the 1873 education tour for American teachers included Abbotsford on the itinerary, and that appears to have led to a six-fold increase of American visitors, which was subsequently sustained. The Trossachs had long been a high point of Cook's tours, and as a destination they owed much to the Lady of the Lake, which opens, of course, with a deer's eye view over the landscape. The noble stag was pausing now upon the mountain's southern brow, where broad extended far beneath the varied realms of fair Menteith. With anxious eye he wandered o'er mountain and meadow, moss and moor, and pondered refuge from his toil by Farlachard or Aberfoyle. But nearer was the copsewood grey that waved and wept on Loch Achray, and mingled with the pine trees blue on the bold cliffs of Benvenue. Fresh vigour, with the hope returned, with flying foot the heath he spurned, held westward with unwearied race, and left behind the panting chase. The stag's eye view was absolutely central to Scott's legacy. For from the deer hunt to Bradwardine's Bran and Busker, Scott popularised the Scottish greyhound or deerhound. Duncan MacNeill, later Lord Colonsay Archibald, his brother, later Keeper of the Registers of Scotland, instigated an extensive deerhound breeding programme as part of a revival of the breed in tribute to Scott, who of course owned them. Edwin Landseer, who produced frontispieces and vignettes to the Wave the Knolls in the 1820s, began painting and popularising the image of the deerhound, and illustrated, of course, a standard manual on their quarry in 1838, which is why, though I don't have time to go into it now, the Monarch of the Glen, painted in 1851 for the House of Lords initially, actually is a covert tribute to the House of Stuart, because Landseer knows perfectly well that he's not depicting a monarch, he's depicting a royal stag. And that that tradition, which goes back indeed to Denham's Cooper's Hill in the 1640s, of describing the Stuart monarch as a deer, is what Landseer is referring to. It's a very interesting and covert reference to the nature of the characterisation of deer and deerhound. But Scott's vision of the deerhound as a noble breed and as a metaphor for the Scottish past, which was also a metaphor for progress and development, because of course the deerhound underpinned, and the legend of the deerhound and deer stalking as a concept linked first to the deerhound and then later to stalking with guns, underpinned the huge increase in deer forest land use in Scotland in the 19th century, remained central to the interpretation of that culture. So as D.T. Thompson put it in The Dogs of Scotland in 1891, the deerhound is in every respect like a Scottish chieftain of olden time, noble, bold, vigorous, and quick to the kill. The deerhound, in that sense, is the 19th century future of Scots' 17th and 18th century pasts. In 1863, Captain Graham used the deerhound to revive the Irish wolfhound, which had been declared extinct in 1836, and this breed, revived, went on to be a symbol for Irish nationalism by the close of the 19th century. The old became the new once more. From the half-mythical national hounds of the past, Scott's influence had fashioned two revived and half-invented breeds, a major new rural industry, a huge change in land use, and the metaphor of speed and skill as a different and recreational type of modernity, which in Scotland, very differently from Ireland, became an image, most memorably perhaps relived in John Buchan's John McNabb, but in Ireland became the contribution of a new state. So old and so new. Time is so fast, and we've noticed that most definitely in the last 2 years. But I have to say that Scott is still ahead of it. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the toast to the memory of Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott